Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to another edition of the Innovation Conversation series. My name is Ben, and I work for the Innovation Facility here in UNDP. We have this series of innovation conversations to stimulate new ways of thinking and doing in UNDP. And I'm really happy today to have Mark and Ted from Camber Collective with us for a talk on impact modeling. I'm not going to give a spoiler on what impact modeling is, but will say that Camber Collective is not yet a partner of UNDP, but one of the many actors out there pushing the envelope in terms of what's possible with new emerging data sets, what's possible with modeling initiatives to improve the impact that we are making, among other initiatives. What I really liked when I met Camber Collective is kind of the combination of two ways of thinking that we very much in the Innovation Facility, together with all of you, embody, which is the combination of thinking about systems change and the SDGs as an interconnected agenda, and breaking it down into testable hypotheses and really into concrete experiments that can give us an indication of what actually makes progress against the SDGs. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mark and Ted. Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be here. We're thrilled to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation. We have hopefully about 40 minutes of content, and then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. Really what our objective is just to share some of our insights about the practice of impact modeling, how we've used it on a couple different of our projects with partners, to really just inspire conversation about ways it might be applicable as you think about your work. So that's what I basically just said. We're going to do a quick intro to our firm just so you understand a little bit about who we are. Mark will really take us through the main part of the conversation around impact modeling, and then we'll share a couple of our case examples and then leave time for Q&A. Very quick on introductions. My name is Ted Schneider. I'm a partner of Camber Collective. I founded this firm in 2009, so we're coming up on our 10th year next year. And I'll describe a little bit more about our firm in a second, but we are at the highest level, a consulting firm really laser focused on creating and driving social impact, both in a global context as well as a domestic context here in the US. You can see a little bit about my background. Mark and I are both very enamored of the SDG framework, so you can see also our icebreaker, I guess, in this sense is we picked our 3 favorite SDGs, mine being number 3, good health and well-being, number 4, education, and number 10, reduced inequities. Mark?
Hi, everybody. I'm an associate in the Paris office of Camber Collective. I've worked a lot in West Africa over the last year or so. Before that was in impact investing and introducing an SDG framework to impact investors. So that's a little bit about me. And yes, like Ted, I have my favorite SDGs listed. So no poverty, peace, justice, strong institutions. I used to be an attorney, so it sort of speaks to my heart. And then perhaps the one that I most enjoy, partnerships for the goals, coalition building around shared objectives and development progress.
Really quick in terms of who we are. I apologize if you're in the back. I know these are really hard to see. I'll try to cover the high points in my remarks. As I mentioned, we're a consulting firm, and our thesis is we can take private sector innovations and apply them to the social sector and really create momentum and movement in the social impact sector. We're a firm of about 30 people. We really work. You all right? You all right? Okay. I don't want to injure anyone with this setup. We have experience working, like I mentioned, in a global context, over 50 countries, as well as a domestic context, and we have really a balanced portfolio between work in both those settings. We typically work for foundations, philanthropies, multilateral institutions, governments, really on their agendas around creating social impact. And you can see some of the places our work has been featured. I think most important on this slide is the right side of this slide, which is we tend not to organize ourselves into SDG buckets, sectors, things like that. We have a broad sector experience and certainly bring fluency to those, but we are not we don't prescribe to be technical experts in any certain area. We bring functional expertise, and we bring that in really 3 areas. The first on the top left being customer insights and market segmentation. So really understanding the attitudes and behaviors of people and how we can help better serve underserved populations. The second being strategy development, resource allocation. How can organizations make better decisions about how to prioritize precious resources to drive the most impact? And then the final one, which Mark began to refer to around coalition building. How can we, coalitions are obviously a critical part of how to create impact, but how can you do that most optimally? How can you really create a coalition that brings the right level of impact to the topic that's being addressed? So we think of ourselves as very horizontal. I was struck when I read the UNDP strategic plan. A lot of the things in there are consistent with this idea that we made a lot of progress against the Millennium Development Goals with sort of point-specific solutions, and that the challenges we face now are systems-level challenges that will require both technical expertise as well as sort of this cross-cutting functional expertise, and that's where we see our role in this. If you sit in the back, you won't be able to see this at all, and I certainly apologize. I think these will be posted later. And the point is not to take you through the specifics of these. I just want to mention sort of the way we approach things. We're very much a framework-driven culture in our firm, and we work with partners around framework development. Almost always the first part of our projects and engagements are around framework development. And some of the tools we use here, you can see. We have a couple mantras in our firm. One is always be listening. We think listening is a critical part of what we do, but always be frameworking also. Always try to be organized the conversation, to be very structured, and coming up with strategic frameworks to help address the opportunities. System mapping is another one that we're really excited about. We've really been doing this in the last year or so. It's another sort of innovative approach to addressing these systems level issues. How do you really organize all of the actors in the system, the relationships, and the key barriers that exist in a system? We began creating system maps for access to contraceptives and access to abortion services in the U.S. It was so successful, we then adopted it into a couple other contexts. We built these for oral health. We built one in the U.S. around opioid crisis because it's really is a system level issue. The opioid crisis, there's not one solution that will really address the majority of that issue. And it's just been a very effective way to really articulate and pull apart where in systems are barriers for people to achieving the optimal outcomes. In the bottom left, segmentation. This is, again, sort of a private sector approach to understanding how do you not treat a population as a monolithic group of people, but really understand not just the demographic characteristics, but the sort of psychosocial attitudes and behaviors of a group of people, so you can be much more targeted about how you approach them and drive demand for interventions and approaches with that population. And then the last one we mentioned on this slide is what we're here to talk to you about today, the notion of impact modeling. Really the idea of applying, again, sort of from a private sector perspective, financial modeling, pro forma modeling, not with financial outputs, but with impact outputs. How can you really think about, from a projection forward-looking perspective, how can you think about what activities you're doing today and how that will influence whatever outcome you're looking for in the future, whether that be mortality aversion, some intermediate goals. There's several contexts we'll talk about where we've applied this. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark to go through a bit more detail on impact modeling.
Thanks, Ted. First of all, thanks to a number of you who reached out to me via LinkedIn before this talk. That's not something that typically happens before we come and speak to people, but it's been great to get a sense of the appetite that everybody has for impact modeling, and also to get a feel for those of you who have a good amount of expertise in this area and have ventured into impact modeling, and similarly those who perhaps haven't been exposed to it and are curious to learn more. I think typically as consultants, we like to start out with a jazzy definition slide where we simplify everything into sort of 15 tight words. With impact modeling, I feel that rather than just a definition slide, it helps to think about the problem we're trying to address. And the central problem that, as you know better than we do in the development sector, as in the private corporate world, is how to maximize returns on capital deployments. Investments that you make, you obviously want to heighten the return that you get. And in a corporate context, this is somewhat easy to understand, maybe more difficult to achieve, but there are a number of frameworks of decision-making processes, of data gathering methods that are well known, that have evolved over the decades, that mean that decision-making in the corporate world can be streamlined and can be also focused around the returns, which are ultimately just financial returns. So they're very tangible and they're very immediate. In the development and social sector, it's obviously a lot more complicated. The returns that everybody's looking for from investments in development vary widely. They can be changes in policies, they can be numbers of lives saved, they can be numbers of lives improved, or they can be perhaps not focused so much on the number of people that you're targeting, but on targeting the most extreme element of a social issue. And that's all fantastic work, obviously, but makes it very, very difficult to compare the returns that are made on investments across different subject areas. Measuring returns is difficult. There are different definitions of returns. And also, again, where you know far more about this than we do, there can be a lag between the strategies you put in place and actually implementing them. And therefore, the social return of an investment from UNDP, for example, I imagine may take a number of months or years to actually be measurable. And so the risk that our partners tell us they face when they navigate their investments, and our partners, as Ted alluded to, are often organizations like UNDP who are making major innovative attempts at change. The risk is that decision-making gets made on sort of old habits, upon external opinions, upon existing relationships we might have with external organizations. And sometimes that's obviously going to work very well, and sometimes it's not going to be the optimal use of an investment capital. And so our proposed remedy is impact modeling, and we have a definition on the bottom right there, which I'm going to read out because it's not the snappy 12-word definition. It's the complete definition as we see it for impact modeling in the development sector. Impact models are structured, data-driven tools that predict the likely development outcomes of competing strategies or projects through logical arrangement of qualitative and quantitative data into a forecasting framework. So they're really the three elements. That gives you probably a rough sense of why we're excited to use them. Quick word on what they're not. They're not designed typically to be extremely, extremely precise, perfect calculations of what's going to happen. They're just designed to assist with comparing different possible courses of action and what the likely approximate return of those will be. Another thing that we like about the sort of impact modeling frameworks is that they are very much adaptive. So we've had projects where we are essentially leading just an impact model, and that's 80% of the work we're doing. And we've also had projects where impact modeling is just a sort of final element of a much broader project. And I think it's important to stress that while impact modeling can be made very precise, at least to some degree, and factor in a million different factors, it can also be streamlined into a very easy to develop model that can be sort of done in a short time frame. So depending on what your objective is, a very detailed or much more streamlined model can be constructed. Typically, our partners are in one of three stages. They're either looking for help implementing a broad strategy, or they're looking for assistance on how to put in place a portfolio of investments that's going to have maximum social return, or sometimes they're looking at a very specific investment in one area, a one-off investment that they want to make sure they get right. And what we have on this slide, for those who can hopefully read it, is, again, just a summary of the kinds of models you can build. So if you're looking at a very high-level sort of introductory strategy guidance, then we can put together a light lift decision framework, or perhaps a sort of a light lift model that's ready made, all the way through to more specific investments where we can really put together a much more complex boutique analysis, taking in a large number of fairly complex and sometimes unknown factors at the outset. We can talk more about that, perhaps at the end, but I think it's important to stress that an impact model is an adaptable beast. To be effective, it needs a few things. Ultimately, it needs clear goals. So knowing what is the social change, the development return that we want to achieve is one. And the second element is impact-related performance data. So do we have prior data or some reliable assumptions that can be made as to how a situation can evolve as a function of certain inputs? The next step after that is to specify, again, the level of the question that you're trying to answer. So again, are we talking about a high-level strategy choice or a much more micro-level investment decision? And then also just right-sizing, as we discussed. So making sure that we are very clear about the amount of time, human resources, and data inputs that are required to create the model. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the different facets of an impact model. Impact models at the moment are frequently underutilized, or they're utilized fairly late in the day. What we see is a lot of our sort of international development partners either not using impact modeling or using it retrospectively. That is, that at the end of an investment that you might make, you'll model what changed as a function of what input, and there'll be some sort of measurement and evaluation report on that basis. What we like to sort of try and encourage is to use impact modeling actually as an upfront strategy to define goals, to define a course of action. Sometimes that helps with aligning disparate stakeholders around a common strategy. Sometimes it's just within an organization itself working out what is going to be the best use of frequently very scarce resources. And so we like to use impact modeling to develop an initial theory of change, or to devise or improve upon an initial broad macro strategy, as well as to ascertain the sort of differing development potentials of different actions that might be available to you. So we have that all sort of mapped out there. I won't talk you through all of the little model, but really the key point is that from our point of view, and from the point of view of the partners who've done this, actually using impact modeling upfront is going to be far more effective than using it to use it as a reporting mechanism at the back end. That said, there are definitely some complications with impact modeling. We would love to walk in and say, everybody can just do this straight off the bat. Some of the issues we've already alluded to, but I think really three that we see coming up frequently is the format of data. So where data exists, it's often not in a simple, accessible sort of format that everybody can interpret, or the methodology that's been used to collect the data varies from one project to another. And so again, the comparison is somewhat complicated. The second common sort of bucket of issues we have is to do with data ownership. So we find that much like in any other organization, often the people who are closest to the data gathering and interpreting are not always the ones who are ultimately driving an organization's strategy. And there can be sort of some nuance lost between those who are in the data and those who are then working out what to do with the data. And then the third sort of issue area we come across, and our partners tell us they struggle with, is just, again, the complexity of the data that they collect. So sometimes it's organized in a difficult manner, and sometimes it's hard to sort of translate what the data is into an actual actionable strategy. So they're sort of the hurdles that we try and sort of help partners overcome and equip them to overcome themselves where they need it. But I guess the silver lining for all of that effort is that, in our experience, impact modeling has really yielded tangible and really high-scale results for the work that our partners do. So we've put 3 out of many examples we could have picked at the bottom of our slide there. But I think one that stands out for me is the development forecasting. So we revealed the impact of full-scale vaccination coverage in relation to childhood sort of sickness, essentially. And we were able to work out that as a result of the impact models, if certain decisions were made based on those models, up to 1 million child lives could be saved. We also designed a programmatic strategy for cryptosporidium. Is that how?
That's
yeah,
right.
I always struggle with that one, which is a pathogen that it emerged actually drives 25% of diarrheal disease and mortality in sub-Saharan African children. And so we've been able to model sort of the life-saving impacts of a variety of interventions based on that discovery. And then going outside of health, we showed the poverty-reducing impacts of investing in different agricultural commodities, and actually the impact on farmer incomes of perhaps reorienting investments away from certain crops towards others. So that's just a little flavor of what can be achieved if impact modeling is embraced in all its forms. I think I'm going to hand over to Ted now. We've got a couple of examples that we were keen to walk you through to make this a little bit more immediate and a little bit more practical. And the first one is in the nutrition space.
Yeah, and I think the three that Mark just mentioned were, we wanted to give you sort of a quick view of a few, but then do a deeper dive on these two. This first one is really a project in the nutrition space. Obviously very significant issue in young children ages 0 to 5, especially that first 1,000-day period. The number of adverse outcomes from malnutrition is very significant. So in this project, this was funded by a foundation who was very interested in investing in nutrition in their target countries. And they were eager to understand how they should be thinking about their portfolio, how they could shape their portfolio to drive the most impact for nutrition outcomes. We looked at 5 geographies. We looked at 9 nutrition-related interventions. And we looked not only at averting mortality, but also how can you improve some intermediate outcomes that would have really lifelong benefits downstream if you could improve some of those intermediate outcomes. So just to get into it a little bit, you can see that we began by sort of organizing the information. And as Mark said, I think especially in this context, we'll get to the outcomes and sort of what the impact model told us. But I think the process of actually going through the structuring was, if if not more impactful than the actual outcomes, for people to really understand the system impacts of one intervention, how it impacts intermediate outcomes, really refining their theory of change, and really understanding how all these pieces fit together. We started this project by really just doing the mapping of the interventions and how some of these interventions on the left, around breastfeeding, malnutrition treatment, complementary feeding, maternal nutrition, and food fortification, drive changes in risk factors, which you can see here, and then eventually mortality. But these came to, really these charts that were indicative of people's theories of change and help them clarify their work. This is an example of some of the pathways that we created. Again, this is before you start doing anything with data or with models or anything like that. It's just working a whiteboard to say, what is the pathway here that we're dealing with, and how do we impact these outcomes we're trying to drive? So in this case, we began with, this is for breastfeeding. We began with promotion. How do you promote productive breastfeeding practices through a variety of channels, the home channel, community channel, in the health system, the workplace, and through mass media. Those then drive adoption of behaviors around 3 different types of breastfeeding: immediate initiation, exclusive breastfeeding from the ages of 6 to 24 months, and then continued breastfeeding beyond 6 months, who are exclusively fed breast milk. Then this requires sort of literature review and again, this sort of technical expertise, linking those behaviors with mortality aversion, causes of newborn death in the first month. So obviously that gets a connection from just immediate initiation. You can avoid sepsis, pneumonia, diarrhea, cause deaths just by driving immediate initiation. Immediate initiation, you can also see, has a flow down to later stage mortality related to diarrhea, pneumonia, and some other disease states. And then when you move to exclusive breastfeeding, you have these direct impacts as well into the mortality reduction, but also you begin to affect some of the intermediate outcomes like diarrhea, affliction, stunting, which then we know if you can reduce the rates of stunting, you can reduce mortality through that intermediate pathway. So it's interesting, something like exclusive breastfeeding has an intermediate path it takes where it affects stunting, and then stunting causes challenges which drive mortality. But there also is evidence of direct impact on mortality from exclusive breastfeeding. Whereas continued breastfeeding, you can see there's not literature, there's not evidence that says continued breastfeeding would impact diarrhea the same way. The flow there is only into this these direct causes. And again, this is the part of our work where we're working with technical experts, we're doing literature scans, we're looking for, this is the part of this. This is sort of like looking at the peer-reviewed journals for the evidence that we can then pull into this analytic framework. The way this then works is usually these things are stated in what are called odds ratios, which says if you get the intervention, the likelihood of you having the adverse outcome decreases. So your odds of getting the adverse outcome improve. This slide shows that for timely initiation of breastfeeding, that top box on the previous slide, we collected some initial data. This is timely initiation of breastfeeding in Bihar. So this is one of our target geographies. And we said, okay, there's 9.6 million live births in Bihar. In the current state, 11% of mothers receive promotion around timely initiation of breastfeeding. And of those, the 11% of mothers, 69% who get the promotion practice timely initiation. Of the people that don't get the promotion, 55% practice timely initiation. So there's a big gap, 14% gap. If you can promote more effectively, you'll see you're more likely to practice. That's the current state. So then we took through two interventions. We said, first of all, let's drive the promotion rate if we could drive it from 11% and really push promotion hard to 80%. So you get 80% of new mothers who are exposed to this promotion. You could drive more people to the right of this diagram, basically. So you have more people receiving the promotion and then more people practicing. It adds about another 522,000 newborns who are receiving timely initiation. And the second leakage we talked about is that we had some evidence that we could improve the efficacy of the promotion. So in this case, we thought there was evidence that we could improve the efficacy, and this gets in the odds ratios. It's a little bit technical, but basically by about 50%, improve the efficacy by about 50% of this promotion. And that would drive, again, so now we've increased promotion so that 80% of new mothers are getting the promotion. The efficacy of the promotion is better. It drives a more improvement on the timely initiation. Now we've added 836 newborns who are getting timely initiation. This one is a little bit unique because promotion is obviously not a biomedical intervention. You can't improve the efficacy of a vaccine has an efficacy rate that it's hard to change the efficacy rate of that. Promotion is one where there are techniques, social media techniques, ways to improve the messaging around that we have evidence you can improve the efficacy of promotion. So in this model, we've said we have two levers. We can drive another 836 newborns into receiving timely initiation of breastfeeding. And then our model would effectively then be able to compute based on those pathways we talked about, what's the lives saved across multiple different disease states. Again, it's going to flow through the immediate disease states. It's going to flow into incidence of diarrhea, stunting, and then the subsequent mortality rates. You can see here on the left, again, this is just in Bihar. We computed that we could improve the rates of timely initiation of breastfeeding from 56 to 72%. This is from 2014 baseline data up to the goals in 2020. Exclusive would improve from 42% up to 70%, and continued breastfeeding would move from 89% up to 95%. again, when you put all that through the analytic framework and the model, then you can see where the lives saved come from that. You can see that the bulk of the lives saved comes from exclusive, moving people more into exclusive breastfeeding in that critical 0 to 6 month stage. Timely initiation and continued breastfeeding do have impacts, but you can see the outsized impact is on the exclusive side. This is just for Bihar, though. We pulled all of this together across, as I mentioned, 5 different geographies, 9 different interventions. We saw 3 of those just now. But if you bring all of that together, and this ends up being, this was quite a large impact model, as you might imagine. We were able to compare the life-saving potential in all the geographies across all of our interventions. And a couple things that this told us was, obviously these numbers are impacted by the populations in these regions. You can see some of the on the right, the percentages of total deaths averted by geography and where there would be more significant impact. So Nigeria, even though it's an extremely populated country, would have the highest impact of life-saving aversion. Again, it's probably within the margin of error. As Mark said, we don't prescribe that these are exactly precise, but it does let you know that there's a big opportunity in Nigeria. At the bottom is on the stack bar charts. Part of what this tells us is in every geography, breastfeeding is very impactful. That if we can drive more effective breastfeeding behaviors, that will have significant life-saving potential. But it also tells us in places like Nigeria and Burkina Faso, the sort of rust-colored box here is treatment of severe acute malnutrition. That really programs to address how you treat, how you diagnose and treat acute malnutrition would be quite impactful relative to other geographies. And this analysis really then led us into shaping a portfolio of investments and programs for this foundation to really, how do they construct their portfolio based on some of the outcomes here. And it also allowed them to create sort of a plan by which they said, okay, we intend to scale up these interventions. Let's measure how we're doing against that. And let's see, are we seeing reductions in some of these disease states as we would expect? So it's sort of, as Mark said, we did at the beginning, so it set a measurement framework for them to manage to over the course of this strategy, which goes through 2020. That was a lot of information and a little bit technical, but I'm happy to answer any questions as we come back to it at the end.
Great. So that was a great example, I think, of a real deep dive into impact modeling. Hopefully not too deep, but it's very difficult to convey in just a few slides. You may be relieved to hear that the next one is going to be a much lighter touch impact model. But so there's a couple of reasons I want to sort of talk you through this one, and I'll try to go a little bit quicker because I think we may have only a few minutes remaining. But the first reason is that this is a model that can be done in a much shorter time period. And the second reason is that it combines impact modeling with another innovation that we mentioned earlier, psychosocial segmentation. And for me, that's really the exciting thing about impact modeling, is that if you bolt on a couple of other innovative approaches, you can really maximize the impact that you're looking to have. So a little bit of context up front. We were approached by a foundation in the US, the Hewlett Foundation, who were looking to fund health-related projects in West Africa, particularly in maternal health and family planning. And we were aware that Niger in sort of central West Africa has the highest, or at least one of the highest, fertility rates in the world, at almost 8 children on average per woman. And that the government of Niger is extremely concerned about this for obvious reasons. They've got very scarce resources. Politically, it's a very precarious region. And so being able to bring population growth in line with what the government is looking for is critical to sort of safeguarding the future of the country and making sure that other development programs are effective. And our remit initially on the segmentation side was to break down the hidden levers of behavioral change among women in Niger to bring them to family planning, whether it's sort of modern medical methods or traditional methods. And so this ended up being a fairly successful project. It was commissioned again in Côte d'Ivoire and in Benin, and there's a number of other countries that are interested. Quick overview of our segmentation approach. I'm not going to walk through this entire slide, but I think the gist is that there's, as you know, a number of ways to do segmentation. What we have tried to spearhead in the social sector is psychosocial segmentation, which is segmentation of populations based around attitudes, behaviors, and sort of beliefs and aspirations. We find that that has led much quicker, much bigger results than purely demographic or psychographic segmentations. There's a whole process to collecting the data to undertake a segmentation, which we've set out on the slides. But there's the usual, initial hypotheses which come from a literature review. So working out what do we think leads certain women to use family planning, and then ultimately designing an instrument to gather data, typically a nationally representative survey, where we really dig deep into behavioral drivers. And then on the back of that, we're able to develop a segmentation, and I'll show you a rough version of the outcome in a couple of slides' time. But we develop a segmentation where we say, okay, broadly, there's 5 or 6 buckets of women. And for each one of these buckets, these are their leading behavioral characteristics. And these are the hidden tweaks that need to be made to the current one-size-fits-all programs to bring them to use of family planning methods. So I'll perhaps leave it at that for this slide. This is a very, very crass simplification of the psychosocial segmentation that we undertook. So just to reassure you, these projects take a few months to do the segmentation, and we get very rich data. We can do all kinds of analyses. But this is how I would summarize each one of the 5 segments of women in Niger when it comes to family planning. So you have what we call the healthy proactives, who say their health is important. They try to learn as much as they can and reduce their burden by spacing births. The sheltered skeptics, which is exactly how they sound. The conservative passives, the modern elites, and traditional autonomists. And we were able to look at the sort of characteristics of each one of these 5 segments. So their size, you can see some are at 28% of the female population, others are just 10. But also working out within each segment, what are the key levers of behavioral change? And we settled on 3 of these 5 segments as priority segments where we thought that our funder and the government of Niger could really bring about huge increases in use of family planning quickly at scale. And so they're the healthy proactives, the traditional autonomists, and the sheltered skeptics. And on the back of that, we were asked to predict, to forecast what the behavioral change would be if the government were to put in place the strategies that we were recommending and implement the programs that we were initially helping them to devise. And so what you have on this slide are the 5 segments across the top, and then 4 broad high-level assumptions for each segment to do with behavioral change. So for those who can't read, we've got the 5 segments across the top, and then we've got on the left here, the assumption that those who are unaware of family planning will become aware of it within a certain time period. And you can see that across the board, we felt that we could make half of the women in each segment aware of family planning. Many are not aware of it. The second assumption is, okay, once they become aware, for those who are already aware but have never used, can we get them to start using family planning? The third one is for those who've discontinued using family planning, can we get them to reuse? And the last one on the left there is how many women are currently using family planning and will continue to do so. We've sort of roughly estimated through these colored circles the proportion of the women in each segment we think match each one of these assumptions. That's based on some very, very detailed data that we decided to spare you for this presentation, but really a lot of data on what we know of their behavioral change and what we know of increasing family planning use in Niger to date. And we reached some estimates of the percentage of women in each segment that we thought could use family planning. So keeping in mind that currently only 12% of the Nigerian population uses, and that the government target is 50% by 2020, you can conclude that the government target is perhaps a little ambitious, but that there's measurable change that's achievable. So from this sort of simplified impact model, and as I said, there's a lot more to it, but this is sort of a visual synthesis. You can do two things. You can reach an aggregated country-level view of what the likely change in family planning behaviors will be over a certain time window. So in this model, you can see 3 key years in pink and blue: 2012, 2015, and 2020. So 2012 was the starting point. It had 12% use of modern contraceptive methods. We were able to model that based on our impact model in aggregated form, we could raise the contraceptive prevalence rate from 12 to 18% in 2015, and then up to 28% in 2020. So not the 50% that the government's shooting for, but more than double current usage rates. So that's one outcome, aggregated views of where a country can get to. Where we like to sort of give a bit more focus is breaking down what the impact potential is per segment of women in this case. But this segmentation methodology is obviously applicable across a whole broad cross-section of issues and populations. And so what you have on the left here is a little map, a visual map of within each of the 5 segments, what is the potential increase in use of modern methods of family planning. So the increase is in pink at the top there. And that really gives you a much more granular understanding of what can be done if resources are allocated to target certain segments of the population, perhaps than just using a one-size-fits-all methodology, or rather than targeting other segments. And what that does, finally, on the right in that pie chart, is it tells you, okay, for the 2020 forecast of 28% of the female population using family planning, what percentage of that 28% falls into which one of our 5 segments? So that really allows for a lot of savings to be made and a lot of efficiency savings to be made, and for resources to be directed towards maximum impact. Goes without saying that after that, implementation doesn't depend on us usually. And so these are forecasts based on recommended strategies that we don't always have ownership of thereafter. Hopefully that felt like a lighter version, but both are very much applicable. And I think with the time we've got remaining, we'd love to open it up to the floor. If you have any questions, if any of that didn't make sense, then please shoot at us both.
Thanks. So we do one question, quick response, and the next question. If you could just introduce yourself briefly, including where you work, also the organization. I saw we have friends and colleagues from UN Women, maybe other agencies also in the room. Who has a question? Yes, please, Jessica.
Thank you very much for this. It's great. I see a lot of complementarities around the theory of change, and you mentioned theory of change as a complementarity to use this in, and especially how to take that evidence and really try to quantify expected benefits at different places in the theory of change. One of the issues we struggle with in UNDP is we work in areas like governance and justice and partnerships, and it's harder to find evidence to quantify. So do you have any examples or advice or tools for how we can apply this to the areas where we work?
I think that, the best case is you find, a peer-reviewed journal article that someone has, gone through the academic study of proving some of these odds ratios and things like that. And that's the ideal case. As you say, it's not always the case. I think what we would try to do in that circumstance is navigate and talk to some technical experts who might have experience that is maybe not peer-reviewed evidence, but they've done enough work in this to develop some hypotheses around that, and that's sort of like the next best. The next best below that would be if you can in a sense reverse engineer from another circumstance where you kind of back into like, oh, the relationship here looks like it's about whatever a some quantifiable number is, and then the the least precise, but still has some value, I think, is sometimes you just have to make an assumption and see what the outcome is, and be very clear about the assumption and what the assumption is based on, and then go out and try to gather evidence to prove or disprove the assumption you made. In a nutrition case, it might be that idea of we can improve the efficacy of promotion. We believe we can improve it by 50%. That in this case, that wasn't an assumption. I would say that's in that second category. I said it wasn't a peer-reviewed article, but they had some experience that said they thought they could improve the efficacy. In a case where you wouldn't have, if you had to make an assumption, sometimes that's okay to make an assumption, demonstrate the outcome, and then try to go back and prove the assumption and iteratively improve your model to say, okay, we actually found it wasn't what we thought. It's maybe it's lower, maybe it's higher, but then continue to improve the model based on that.
So it's investing over the long term,
right?
In this sort of research and data.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I think I'd also add to that just one further possibility that it's not going to be a learning from me, but it's something that I used in sort of prior work with donors who are trying to bring about change in the same space that you're working in, and that is transposing data from other regions or other historical data. So looking at trends, it obviously depends exactly what you're talking about. If you're talking about participation in political processes, or if you're talking about anti-corruption, it depends on the
building capacities of institutions where it's harder to measure. It's a qualitative.
Yeah. So I think one route is definitely to look at the trajectory of institution building in other countries, the rate at which it occurred, and what the inputs were in that case. And certainly, I can think of one example in a sort of prior position where that was what had to be resorted to, but it actually yielded a relatively accurate view of over a 10-year period what sort of change was possible in terms of it was more in transparency of institutions.
We have these questions from the people watching online.
We have online questions, but I would take one from the room first, if there is one. Please. Oh, but introduce yourself, where you work, so the colleagues have an idea of what part of the house you come from.
Okay, cool. Good afternoon. My name is Owen. I work at the Bureau of Management Services at UNIP. Thank you for coming today. It's been fascinating, and you're right. People don't think about impacts enough. I just have two a part A and a part B, because I know Ben doesn't like two questions. So. The first part is, of course, when we're talking about impacts, there's assumptions made about behaviors and how people get there, but you also have to make assumptions about the delivery mode, about the programmatic approach, and especially about quality assurance, etc. So I wondered, first of all, if you consider those assumptions within your model, and the sort of more delivery ones, and second of all, have you had the opportunity to sort of review the impact of your impact modeling? And what assumptions have held, both benefits and programmatic, and which have not held?
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to see how that is.
I will answer this the second question first, I think, which is this nutrition example is a great one where we built this model at the front end of this strategy, and it influenced where they were setting their targets in terms of scaling up different interventions. And part of what we wanted to do was come back and to really summarize, midway through, how are they doing against that? How had they scaled up some of these interventions, and were they seeing the impact that we suggested? And it varied by country on a couple things. One would be what Mark talked about, the availability of the data. So as all of you I know are very aware, data is challenging in these contexts. And understanding, we were able to find baseline data for many of these things, but getting sort of that interim point of saying, what is the practice of timely initiation of breastfeeding, for example, in this country? It was extremely difficult. So in many contexts, it was a data challenge. And then in other places where the data were available, we were able then to feed back in to say, let's update it. Let's see what our model would predict versus how much uptake and how much improvement in the outcomes we were seeing. And in a sense, I think it does get back to the first part of your question, which is many of these things, there's a time lag. So it's not, all of a sudden you're seeing the timely initiation of breastfeeding and then it's automatic. There is sort of a time lapse between many of these things. And so I think we saw the impact coming up a curve, but still, behind a little bit where our projections were, but understanding there was things like delivery risk, there's timing issues. But again, I think it helped them to see, understand and unpack some of those pieces, which also are very important as you think about executing a program.
I'll take the liberty as moderator to just add on. Many of you have been at past conversations in this event series on foresight and scenario planning. And those of you who have been, remember the concept of a black swan, an unlikely event that sometimes can really change the trajectory of, for example, an impact model that can be positive. Let's say on contraception, suddenly there's 2-3 role models or a radio program, right, that's highly popular that advocates for it, and you have a complete, more positive trajectory. Right. Or you have a populist politician coming up with support of conservative parties and the church, and you have a negative trajectory. How do you bake complexity and black swans into your models?
I think a lot depends at the outset what remit we have with the models. So that's not a decision that we typically lead, although we can advise on it. How many variables do you want to bring into play is definitely a conversation to be had. Sometimes, depending on the subject area, the more you bring in, the more scope there is for your model to be off. And so there needs to be a decision made around, okay, based on what we know, what makes sense to isolate as the key variables in that model. I would also say that it's sort of, it depends again on whether you're looking at sort of high-level strategies over a long period or one-off investments over a shorter period. Because obviously, if you're looking at a much higher macro strategy over a 10-year period, then there's more scope for those to be baked in. I think they can be baked in. Certainly, I've seen models where that's done, and often, even in financial modeling, when you're modeling the impacts of an impact investment, you'll bake in a best case and a worst case and a middle scenario. And so typically, that's something we can do. We can say, okay, here's what we think is realistic. Here's what we think can happen if things are implemented, like your colleague was asking about, in the best case way. And similarly, here's a couple of landscape issues that could intervene. So you talk about a populist politician, could be that, which would throw this off. And here's how we estimate the impact on that. So you have a spectrum of impact models. That's certainly a solution that I've seen applied. I don't know if
I would say
I want to do justice to many people asking questions. So let me interrupt you there. Let's get to other questions. That's okay. Because I think this was a really good answer.
I actually think I think there's a really I want to say one more thing, if you don't mind, which is it's impossible to predict the future.
Of
right?
course, you know that.
But what an impact model can allow you to do is once you have it built, you have an outcome you think, you can test it for the sensitivity to certain assumptions. So you can say, if I tweak this up or down 10%, does it change the outcome in a meaningful way or not? And you can see which assumptions in your structure and your framework are most sensitive to change. And that allows you to focus more intently on those assumptions. Either if you have an advocacy program, you're advocating to make sure that this policy stays in place. If it's an environmental issue, you're looking at you're paying more attention to that. So the other thing these frameworks allow you to do is to know what things matter the most and put more attention on those things.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
We have an online audience, and I'd say we take 2 questions from the online audience. And how many more questions are in the room, just to see how brief our presenters have to be? 3. All right, so you got to be brief.
All right.
3 and 4 online. So the first one.
Let's say 2 online.
2 from online. So what methods were used to get the likelihood indicators that you had? And what methods were used for the linear models? So that's actually one question. And the second question is, in the example in the nutrition case, it'd be interesting to hear what were the actions taken after impact modeling. So I think you touched a bit on that already.
So to get in the nutrition model, the odds ratios I mentioned, which are, these are evidence, these are peer-reviewed journal articles. We were lucky. many of the articles were actually written by people in the organization we were working at, so we had access to them to understand, the background of the research. They were able to point us in the direction of where we could find even articles that were about to be published that weren't published. So for that, in that instance, we very much focused on academic journal articles. In the leaner models, it's a mix of sort of background data, inference, some of the things we were talking about before around, you want to avoid making just pure assumptions, but it's in that scale of if you can't find peer review articles, can you at least have a defensible framework that makes sense and is based on some historical context?
And very quickly to add on that, sorry, I think while that was a leaner model, the data that went into it was not so lean. So we, typically with that leaner model, that was based on an hour-long survey that went very, very precisely through women's decision-making trajectory, if they've used and they haven't, why, what would make them use. So we have a lot of data also to then create what looks like a simple set of assumptions.
And quickly to probe on the second question, what was the impact of the impact model?
For the nutrition, in the nutrition context, to me, the most important part of it was that the people who came away and whose remit was to execute against these strategies had a much deeper understanding of their own pathways and how they can create impact through these intermediate outcomes, through the disease states that they really were targeting. For me, the numbers are important, but it's the behavior change of the people who are executing the programs that was more important in this context.
Thank you. Diego, please.
Thank you. So Diego Antoni from the gender team here. So I will be the gender advocate. So I would be very curious to know what were the gender assumptions behind the two exercises that were presented. Of course, women were at the center of both of them. And I would want to know what are the trends coming from the private sector in terms of capturing the gender dimension of social behaviors, power dynamics in the household. So I know that the private sector is doing a lot of work on unconscious bias, right?
Yeah.
But I think we as the UN are ahead of that, and we go deeper. So I'm curious to know what are the trends, how are you capturing the gender dimensions?
I'm happy perhaps speaking to that one at least first, because it's obviously a huge part of the work we do in West Africa. So I think first we work with, within the broad aim of trying to put in place gender progressive solutions. So even in countries where we know that men have a lot of the decision-making power, we do not try to exploit that for quick gains. We try and play a longer game. So I think that's important framing up front. Typically, the way we've dealt with it in a health context in West Africa is looking at behavioral tendencies independently, women and men separately. So we have, for example, in Niger, we have a separate study on the men. And that really allowed us to see what are the roles that women are playing both in society and in the home. How do they vary across segments? Because they definitely do. Similarly, what kinds of men are these women typically pairing up with? Sometimes more than one in places like Niger. And how does that impact the reality of their day, the reality of their freedom, the reality of how they view their life potential, and also vice versa? How do the men behave in their interactions with certain women? So, short answer: we sort of study independently men and women, and then we cross them and we work out where the latent demand is, where the little avenues are that we can feed into, and then advise the governments on the kinds of programs they can implement to tackle those issues specifically. Hopefully that gives at least an initial flavor, but we can definitely talk about it more if we're meeting later.
We have two more questions.
So my name is Kai, I'm from UN Women. So I have, so what I see is that it looks very linear to me, the entire modeling. So knowledge leads to attitudes, attitudes lead to practice. We know from the literature that often this is not the case. So for example, I've been involved in a couple of quasi-experimental designs where we see, well, it doesn't work. And then we found out why it didn't work. And I see a little bit of this, what I think, linearity also in your predictions, because when I saw the curve was rising by, I think, 100,000 persons, I don't know, every year. So I'm wondering, are you based on linear models, or are you, what is the modeling behind it? Because it looks very, like a railroad to me. you do this, then the next follows, and this follows. So what's the logic behind that?
I mean, I would say I think that's part of the point that Mark made earlier, which is I don't think these are meant to be precise around the specific outcomes and the timing. I think these are meant to allow promote decision making, to say if I'm going to make a trade-off between doing X or doing Y, or targeting segment X versus Y, what's the general sense of how much impact that will create? We would never expect that the uptake will be linear, as you said, and precisely that way. There's exogenous factors that will lead it to be, there's timing, there's execution, there's all these other things. So I think at the end, this is not to say this is precisely how it will roll out. It's really meant as a way to deepen the understanding of the work you're taking on, and to promote a rigorous way to make decisions between alternatives, not to precisely predict the outcome. But your point is well taken that these systems we work in have feedback loops. They evolve over time, and I think that's why this is not we do this in a sort of point in time, but it's important to come back and to iterate and to make these models iterative and living over time.
And I'd love to add on to this. I mean, it touched upon Owen's question, right? What if we improve these campaigns? But an important piece of information was on the board that's part of your work, which is the percentage of women who are aware of contraceptive, and the percentage who are aware and actually use it, and the percentage who are not aware and use it. No, that can't be right.
There's a few, in that model. Yeah.
Long story short, what I heard from your message, Kai, was we can make the assumption that if we invest in awareness building and awareness raising, that will translate to behavior change. But I saw that very much as that is a foundation of your work. That's how you approached it. There's no clear correlation. We have to always work on improving that link, right? Mm-hmm. So what we kind of advocate for an innovation team is forget raising awareness. If it's not information gap, think about facilitating action. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. But I think on this piece of work, it's if we continue with the current course of action, if we don't innovate in our work, then this is the projection for the impact that we'll have. And our job is it to think around the how. And that goes really well into the segmentation and the exploration of behaviors. Okay, we had one more question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Isabella, Young Women. I wanted to ask about qualitative data. So where do you feed in qualitative data? You use qualitative data to question the assumptions that you're raising based on the quantitative models.
Yeah, absolutely. A huge part of the work we undertake upfront is qualitative. And you're right, I didn't put it out from our slide. I went a little bit quickly, but typically if we're on a 6-month project, we can estimate that the first 2.5 months are often a combination of literature reviews and qualitative data capture. Depending on the subject area, that kind of qualitative capture can vary in format, but we've overseen everything from ethnography to individual interviews, collective interviews, really the whole range of usual tools, and we really use that to inform our hypotheses, which then shape very precisely the quantitative data capture tool that we create. It's going to be derived from the hypotheses of the qual. And sometimes where we have remit to do so from the funder, we can also go back to qualitative afterwards when we've sort of produced what we think the strategies are from the qual and the quant, and we can test again sort of 1 second time that our hypotheses have actually been validated in the qualitative data. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, with that, I want to say a big thanks to Ted and Mark. Thanks for being with us. Big thanks to all of you. Teaser for the next innovation conversation. It goes back to thinking in systems, and it's with friends and colleagues from Endeavor Research who have fascinating insights on innovation ecosystems in Nigeria, India, and a couple of other countries that actually will challenge a lot of the work that's been done by different actors in the system on working with social entrepreneurs and innovators on the ground. And we're going to have that at the end of November. You're very much invited, and have a good weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.